is sponsored perpetually for this year by Rabbi Michael and Jerry Laxmeter for the Refuah Shlema of the granddaughter Aviasar Bat Shena Arona. So that shouldn't be perpetual. That should have Refuah Shlema already, and then we'll find better reasons to sponsor. So we started a new book, but it's a new book, but with an old story. The old story is, well, that I guess we'll have to work on a little bit to understand the old story. But it's a new book, and it's obvious, I hope, to all of us that we are there's history and there's background, and it's because of this in context, and it's because of this that I think there's various ways of understanding the beginning of Shemot, or for that matter, what we can say the quote-unquote narrative story of Shemot, and part of it is, especially the way that we generally learn, and that is by a lot of, even though Gil did not like the term last week, but we gave him a whole week to get used to it because of our intertextual analysis, in order to see juxtapositions between different sections and to see how one section then sheds lights on another section. And sometimes before you see these kinds of things, you don't understand what's taking place, or I'll say it the other way around. You may understand what's taking place on a certain level, but once you see it, then it's almost like you can't unsee it. So we're going to see things today, which, again, maybe to all of you is completely obvious, but maybe before we note it, it's not going to be, or wasn't necessarily completely obvious. But let's start with Moshe. Moshe is our main character we're going to speak about, and that hopefully, if we're going to pick any character that was completely predictable. Other years we spoke about other people, we spoke about his sister, we spoke about Miriam, we spoke about Serach Bar Asher, we talked about especially Nashim Tzadkaniyot, but Moshe is the main character. Moshe is the one who has been predetermined, appointed, anointed by the divine in order to be the quote-unquote the savior of this particular episode, of this particular story, and therefore it's Moshe who we're going to focus on more than anyone else, but we're going to try to understand the origin story of Moshe with an earlier origin story, and then we're going to try to see the completion of the story, and therefore, essentially, we're going to be moving in two directions today, hopefully. One is moving to the past, and the other is moving towards the future, and or at least the future from Moshe's perspective. And as I said, once we see this, then we'll understand a little bit better. If you want already the title for today, I think what we're going to call this is the Redemption Axis. So...
Redemption of what?
Access.
AX.
Axis. So, Vayelech ish mibeit Levi v'yikach bat Levi. So we're going to leave that for a moment. We'll see Rashi soon. Vatari shava ben vatira oto kitovu vatitzpeneu shlosha yirachim. So there's background to this. I mean, what exactly is the background? The background is source number 3. And that is that we're told that any child who's born will be killed. So bringing a child into a world like this is something. Excuse me. Any boy, my boy. Bringing a child into a world like this is something which could be perceived as completely someplace between futile and cruel. You could decide which way you want to lean more. But that's the background. As we continue, we're told that didn't necessarily work that well, and instead, Vayitzav Paro Pasuk Kaf Bet, L'kol amo lemor kol ben hayilud hayaor tashlichu. So one was initially killing them at birth, and the other one was killing them subsequently, and that's the world that Moshe enters. So what I do want to do is try to understand this in a little bit of a broader conceptual way, even though you can argue with me that why would we ever want to move conceptual when you can just deal with the tragedy itself, which is really quite overwhelming. But there's something which we may be missing, which, as I said, is really what I want to note. In source number 2, Rashi noting Vayelech ish mibeit Levi, and the Divrei Matchil of Rashi is the next couple words, Vayikach et bat Levi. So it sounds as if they just now got married. A man from Levi marries a girl from Levi, and Vatahari Shavatalid Ben, and she gets pregnant and she has a son. Now the problem is that subsequently we're going to learn multiple times that Moshe has older siblings. Moshe has an older brother and Moshe has an older sister, and therefore Rashi finds this a little strange that over here it should be talking about Vayikach. Now, again, a rabbinic message over here that, again, some of us will hear, some of us should hear, and that is that the word Vayikach is one which is connected to marriage. Vayikach ish isha in the very beginning of the Gemara in Kedushin, it says kicha mistei Ephron, so therefore the word Vayikach is one of marriage. So Rashi over here is Vayikach et bat Levi in source 2, Parush hayami mena mibnei gzerat paro. So Rashi over here takes the Gemara and reads it into the verse and said they were married, but they had separated. You can decide separated means divorced or separated means a separation. In parentheses it says v'chazar v'lacha v'zor v'yelech shalach be'itzat bito she'amr lo gzeratcha kashem mishel paro in paro gazar l'schrim v'tagam kin ala nekivot. Now all of that is in the Gemara. I don't know why it's in parentheses in Rashi. It could be Rashi didn't quote all of it and somebody then put the rest of the Gemara back inside. Also notice something. This is my parenthetical comment on the parenthetical comment. Later on in the Torah, we're going to have Miriam speaking about Moshe, who had just separated from his wife, at least. You like my passive aggression? My threats that I won't come back and teach have not worked yet. It could be I need to be more aggressive in my protests. So my parenthetical comment on the parenthetical comment is that we're told later on that Miriam speaks Lashon Hara against Moshe, and there Rashi explains, because Moshe had, it's also that Moshe married a Isha Kushit, but there Rashi says no, he separated. So therefore, Miriam, who's the one who advocates for her parents to get back together, when she hears that Moshe separated, she feels she has a moral right to comment on this, because had she not commented to her parents about getting back together, there never would have been a Moshe. And by the way, that's an important statement. There never would have been a Moshe had it not been for this. And that's part of what Rashi is telling them. And then they remarried and they made a new acquisition, as it were. I think this is meant to be less legal and more romantic. It means that... Okay, I'll say this because it's true, and then you can do anything you want with this. Halacha doesn't necessarily see marrying your ex-wife as something which is really celebratory. Halacha. You're not allowed to get married during the 9 days. If you look in the Shulchan Aruch, you look in the Mishnah Berurah, there's an exception. You can marry your ex-wife during the 9 days. It says why? Because there's not so much simcha involved in marrying your ex-wife. I'm not necessarily advocating anything over here. I'm just stating is that there's, again, I said it's halacha. Halacha is that you don't get married during the 9 days because it's a celebration. But marrying your ex-wife is generally not somebody's going to marry their ex-wife and make a big, big wedding and invite hundreds of people and so on. It's probably something which would be a little bit quieter. So again, that's the point over here. It's saying no, is that they went and they made a whole big celebration about it. Why? Because, again, the Gemara says, because Amram was a leader, and because he separated, a lot of other people did as well. And therefore he had to show that this is a mistaken outlook, and that even though the situation is dire, and even though that there's reason for pessimism is realism in this case, but Judaism doesn't always recognize the realism of pessimism, and rather we have this optimism based upon some other kind of belief in some kind of a divine interaction within our collective lives, and therefore we remain persistently optimistic against all evidence to the contrary. And that's our collective experience as a people. And as you read the Rashi here, that's really an important statement. And that's one which is really easy to miss. I mean, you can look at some of the commentaries starting to do the math to figure out how old she is, including Rashi's continuation here. I'm not reading it, but Rashi just now said something really important. Nafcha liot nahara. So sometimes you get married, she became a young bride again, there's something changed. No, but this is not just talking about emotional. This is not just talking about outlook. It wasn't like she was acting younger than her age, dressing younger, and so on and so forth. But this is saying that she actually became younger again, which means it theoretically could have been, again, I don't want to push this too much, but it theoretically could have been that she was already at this point menopausal, but nafcha liot na'ara. Now, that's really important because, again, I'm just hoping you realize what just now happened is that when I spoke a moment ago about the impossibility of Moshe's birth, well, it's impossible because his parents had separated. It's impossible because his parents are no longer together. But now you just understand the impossibility is compounded by the situation of even if they get back together, she is not as young as she once were, and therefore the birth of Moshe is something which never should have taken place. Now, again, something really interesting just now happened, and I hope I'm saying enough words now that you're already figuring out what is taking place, but if not, you know I'm going to say it much clearer as we continue. But again, just as a starting point over here, Rashi told us something. What Rashi did is he created a narrative, and the narrative over here is the impossibility of Moshe's birth other than there being some other input. Now, the input over here, I can say on the one hand, is the input of the Shekhinah. On the other hand, it's the input of somebody who's acting as the Shekhinah over here on earth, and that takes us back to Miriam, who is this woman who makes sure that children are born, and that's how she's been identified till now. And therefore, not only does she cause these other children to be born, not only does she fight against Paro, she also fights against her father as well. And as much as our language that we have in the Haggadah is that, Lavan bikesh lakarat hakol, it's very interesting because that whole Lavan argument was worse than Paro. It's Amram who's worse than Paro, according to the way that the Gemara is going to spell all of this out. So now, if we take the collective narrative now that we see, some of it's on Midrash, some of it's based on the text. Any male child has been decreed, will be killed immediately. Any male child that wasn't killed immediately will be killed subsequently by being thrown into the water. So we have enough reason to believe that someone like Moshe never should have been born. On top of all that, his parents are not together, so it's very hard to get pregnant when you're not together. On top of all of that, she's not that young anymore, so even if they get together, so all of this just now painted a really interesting picture, and that is that Moshe's arrival is something which is based upon the will of God. That's what we get out of that. Now, if all that wasn't enough, then we continue about what it actually says in the text. And it's at this point that I hope that we understand what's happening, and then you'll see, hopefully, exactly where I am going with this, where it continues, and it says, back in source number 1, in Perek Bet, after Moshe is born, 3 months go by, that's Pasuk Bet, Vatari Shavat Helid Ben, Vetraoto Kitovu, Vatitzpenu Shlosha Yerafim, V'lo yichola od hitzpinu, and she cannot hide him any longer, that as much as the mother wants to protect the child, you just can't anymore. But yikach lo tevat, just like vayikach et bat Levi, so now she gets for him his shidduch, which is what? It's a teva, but it's, as much as our imagination takes us back to the teva of Noach, which in the face of a decree of destruction, is there some kind of a hope of salvation. And over here, it's a primitive teva. V'tikach lo tevat gomer v'tachmara b'chemer v'zefet, and she goes and tries to make it seaworthy, as it were. But we all realize that this is going to be a very primitive boat. I mean, even during Talmudic times, one of the things that you ben shlomo for is if you go in a boat, try to find out what were survival rates when people went on boats in those days. It was extremely low survival rates, because the water is dangerous, and the technology that they had was not necessarily one which will, with high percentages say, I'm not talking about pirates, I'm just talking about dealing with the water and the weather It's not such a, and now over here, the captain of the ship is this 3-month-old. So you realize that the chances over here, and by the way, I didn't even speak yet about certain other things like crocodiles, which keep in mind, because that's the situation here. So once you start thinking about all of these things, I hope you realize that the chances of survival over here are really quite minimal. And it says, "Vatasem ba'etayeled, vatasem besuf al svata ya'ar." And I want to say it again now. She puts them in the reeds. So what are there in the reeds over there? Hope your imaginations now are that's the crocodiles are slithering about over there. And yeah, but Moshe's safe, which means Moshe's survival is one. Again, initially he never should have been born. And if he should have been born, he should have been killed. And if he survived the first time, then he should have been killed over here. And even though we have this heroic, again, you could describe it as heroic, this gesture of saying, let's do all I can to make sure Moshe survives. You were talking about Vegas before. What kind of odds do you get on Moshe's survival over here? It's not great. Nonetheless, something happens, and the thing that happens is going to be completely miraculous, even though all of us read this and have read this as almost something which is natural. Yeah, his sister's there, and there's another woman there, and Bat Paro should not be the one to save him. Bat Paro should be the one to kill him. I mean, again, if you just want to continue along the story, and I actually love Pasuk Vav, because there's a combination of things, and I'll tell you honestly, I had a very hard time preparing the shir this week. And the reason was because I had like 6 different shiurim that were all interconnected, and it kept shifting each day of the week. It shifted again in a slightly, I know you told me, but it's only Thursday, that it started Saturday night, that it kept on shifting to different elements. And at one point, what's bolded in Pasuk Vav was far more prominent in my thinking. Vatiftach, and Bat Para opens it, Vatirehu, and then she sees, and you have this combination of seeing and hearing. Vatireo et hayeled. So what does she see? She sees a little child. Vinei nar boche. But what does she hear? She hears that there is a nar. And a nar is somebody much older. It almost sounds to me, and I know that there's various explanations of this, but it almost sounds to me that there's an objective that you see, seeing is believing, but then there's this imagination of seeing the future, because it's very hard to put together the Yeled and the Nar. It's almost as if she sees the future, and the future, this kid is going to grow up. And by the way, he only grows up because she gets involved. If she doesn't do anything, he doesn't grow up. If she, closes the thing and puts him back there, he doesn't survive. But she sees the Nar, and the Nar is Boche. And the crying of the Nar, and again, it should have been the crying of the Yeled, but it doesn't. It doesn't necessarily move the Egyptians. If that moved the Egyptians, then they never would have gotten into this situation in the first place. But sometimes you realize the ramifications of where things are going. But nonetheless, it's this dual seeing and hearing. By the way, that, for those of you who don't recognize, should take us to Har Sinai, because Har Sinai, Re'uat HaKolot, and this ability to see sound, but she sees something and she hears something, and how do you put together the different senses becomes something which is interesting. By the way, obviously, Moshe's, and I'm going to have a couple of candidates. What's the highlight of Moshe's life? One of the highlights that you can obviously claim is standing at Sinai, and at Sinai what happens? All the people get to this point of a nevuah, and they all get to the point that they can all see the sounds, and they're able to transcend where they are right now. I actually saw a great comment by the Kutzker that they had to see the sounds because they only heard the words. So it says, what do the words say? Lo tignov, lo tirtzach, lo tinaf. So the people only heard it. They could have made believe it said it with the lamed vav. So therefore, they have to see the sounds. They see with the lamed aleph, right? Lo tignov instead of lo tinaf. So anyway, that's the Kutzker. So I hope you love the Kutzker for that. But it's much more than that. It's not just functional. It's because it takes them to a prophetic experience, and that would be fascinating. That within the very aura of Moshe Rabbeinu, suddenly this woman, and by the way, just consider it for a second. I know that Chazal go into divergent ways. One path that they take is to say, oh, she was going there because she wanted to convert and she wanted to go to mikveh and so on and so forth. And the other one is just, again, think about it. If they're throwing all the babies in the water, this is the killing fields. This is full of corpses. This is the most horrific place in the world. And if you're going to say, oh, let's take a stroll, and go down to the place where there's full of dead babies, that itself comes from a place which is just completely cruel, and you don't understand how we got to this point, because there should be no surprise about this. There should be other people who were killed. This is not the place you want to go on a Sunday morning, and just take in the rays and so on and so forth. This is completely horrific, but nonetheless, she sees, she hears, and to me that's really interesting, because maybe she just now again experienced something prophetic within the area of Moshe, and now she's able to see the future as well, and then she makes some kind of a choice, a heroic choice. And that heroic choice is, would I want to be part of this present, this horrific present? Do I want to be part of this society, or do I want to be part of this future? And by the way, according to not just Chazal, according to the Pasuk in Divrei Hayamim, she leaves Egypt and she marries a Jew and she becomes part of the Jewish people. That's not a medrash, that's a Pasuk. So therefore, her future becomes that future, and she ends up by Sinai, and she does end up seeing the sounds. So that then becomes a lot more interesting in terms of understanding Bat Paro at this particular moment. But I want to use one more word to explain what I've said till now, and that word will then open up, and then you'll know exactly what it is that I want to say. In a certain sense, when Moshe's mother takes him out and brings him to this place, carries him together with this primitive boat, pieces of wood, which are going to be thrown together with the tar and whatever. It's at that moment that I want you to imagine and to understand that we've seen this before, and that I would call this Akedat Moshe. And the place we had it before was, of course, with Akedat Yitzchak, with carrying him up to a mountain where he's going to be killed. But it's not just that Yitzchak was going to be killed. It's much more than that. It's that every word I've said till now about Moshe, the same exact words applied to Yitzchak as well. Which means you should have had a sense, oh, we've seen this movie before, we've heard this story before, but of course you'll say, no, we didn't see, it's not the same, because it's somebody else and it's different people, except for everything that we just now saw, which should have made it in a much more similar sense. And again, if I stop with Moshe for a second, I know that Moshe's story is just so rich, and maybe it's hard for us to pinpoint and just to stay on those elements that I wanted to stay, because we have, the next step. We have Moshe walking out of the palace, which, by the way, and his life gets threatened again. We have Moshe's life continually threatened. It's like the improbability of Moshe to be able to fulfill the mission. Even when he's on his way back to Egypt, something happens and Moshe's life is threatened, which means his life is constantly threatened. And nonetheless, so why does he survive? Because there's a divine story. He is on a mission from God. He has been chosen. That's a Chicago. He has been chosen to do a certain mission, and it's almost God saying, put every single obstacle in the way. The less likely that this is, the more likely you understand that this is the will of God, and the more likely then you'll understand that this has to succeed. That's a part of this story over here. So therefore, and for that matter, Moshe would make the perfect ArtScroll biography, right? He's young, he goes out, he's motivated, he wants to save his brothers and do his mission and so on, and then it doesn't work and he's frustrated and he's rejected, and that could be the end of the story, but no, he comes back even double, and then he becomes even this great leader, right? It's the template for every single biography, right? And unless maybe he didn't go to yeshiva as a kid, so maybe it's maybe Moshe's not going to make it. But nonetheless, there's this frustration when he goes out and tries the first time to be a redeemer. It's as if he knows his role, but the Jews just don't want him. He tries, they don't want him. And then his life is threatened again. Paro wants to kill him again. So this threat on Moshe's life, Paro wants to kill him, right? And then Paro makes him be thrown off, and then and then again Paro wants to kill him, and so on. Which means Moshe should not survive. That's part of what I'm really hoping that you get out of this. That you see. It's just that the story is so rich in so many ways that it's a little hard for us to have noticed. Which I hope that you notice, and that's what I alluded to before. I hope you can't unnotice that now. And if you just go back and think about where should we start, look at source number 4. This is our introduction to Avraham's wife, who we'll later know as Sarah. Now she's Sarai, v'tihi Sarai akara, ein lavlad. What does that mean in English? She can't have children. Biologically, she can't have children. What exactly is her situation medically? I cannot tell you. Right? Chazal go into various, there's even, I think we learned this not that long ago, there's even an expression in Chazal that she didn't have a womb, that it was impossible. She can't have a child. Whatever is the situation or the medical situation, I don't need to go further than a pasuk in the Torah. Sarah can't have children. Avram and Sarah will not have children. That's the default. Later on, we're going to get to a pasuk when the men come, and the men, or the angels, however you want, and they say that Sarah's going to have a child. Avram's already been told by God in the previous chapter, over here in Perek Yudchet, but it's that Sarah bikirba lemacharei b'alti atili ednav adoni zaken. So it's interesting, that's pasuk Yud Bet, right? In pasuk Chet, Rashi makes a comment, which I'm not exactly sure how to reconcile. This is for you to work on. You figure this out. You have a Torah next year for Vayera. V'yikach chem'ah, v'lechem, because she was told to bring certain things. V'lechem lo hivi, but she didn't bring the bread. Now this is a wonderful example of Rashi telling us that Avram and Sarah were sensitive to certain laws of Tumah and Tara, which are not going to be revealed till way down the line. But it says, why didn't she bring the bread? Lefisha pirsa Sarah nida. So Sarah, who presumably is already menopausal, she now reverts back that day to become a young person again. So hold it. By the way, I don't know why she's laughing a couple psukim later when she's told that she doesn't have a child, because she just now had gone through some kind of significant change within her body. Again, that's what Rashi's comment to Pasuk Chet. And then afterwards, we're told that she laughs and says, how is this possible? I'm already old. But now she has perhaps some counter evidence to her being old. So as I said, you can try to reconcile that. Could be that still somewhat shocking, given her history. But there's another element over here. And this other element, hopefully now, will solidify everything that I wanted to say. And the angels or men say, Ke'et chaya, next year at this time, Ke'et hazot l'shana haba, u'pesach chaya. U'lepesach haba nolad Yitzchak. So, I don't want you to miss that. Yitzchak is born on Pesach, which means when we want to know, where do we start the Pesach story? Right? I guess we have that question already in the Mishnah, which then makes its way to the Haggadah. Like, where do you start the Pesach story? Right? Aramid Avid Avi, like, what are you exactly doing? Matchil Bignud, Messiah B'Shabbat. So where do you start the story? But we should understand that the story has, like, as far as we're concerned, it has like this dual starting point. The real starting point, obviously, is the Brit Bein HaBetarim. But the Brit Bein HaBetarim had within it certain language which should have alerted us that it actually is a little bit later. If you look at source number 8, and again, that's foreshadowing. Fear, darkness, incredibly, right? Darkness falls upon him. So Avraham, before he has children, is being told that your children, who he doesn't have, who seem like an impossibility, are going to be enslaved. Again, go back to the impossibility of the story. The whole Pesach story is impossible. It's impossible from the very first moment that we're told about it. If you would have said to Avraham, a different word, not Zeracha, if you would have said to Avraham that your students will be as numerous, Zeracha is not the word that you use. Zera. By the way, I'll say parenthetically, sometimes if one discusses, I don't know if you do or don't know if you should or don't know if you ever even thought about it, but but believers of Christianity who will point at Isaiah chapter 53 as the quote unquote suffering servant, one of the things it says there, but he will see his zera, he will have children. So unless Jesus had children, this verse does not speak about him. It also says, by the way, he'll die from disease. It doesn't say he'll die from a crucifix and so on. But the zera is the important point. Zera is a very specific term. So over here as well, Avram being told, not Hanefesh Yeshar Sabacharan, not the people that you've inspired, your children, your descendants. So do you understand that Avram receiving this, before you go any further in that verse, there's this darkness, there's this fear, and God says, your descendants, right then, your descendants, so that itself should be something which, as I said, we have this optimism because we know how the story is going to end up. And he says, your descendants, which itself is completely miraculous, again at that moment, your descendants, and so on and so forth, and they're going to come back, which means they're going to get this land, they'll be back, they'll be living in this land, and the story has a happy ending. So if you're Avraham, the message of the Brit Bein HaBetarim, even though there is this, we always take the longer way, we always take the detour, we always, in retrospect, maybe there's a better way. No, that again, the difficulty is going to be a part. And this is what we really have to end up understanding today, that the difficult path that we take is part of the story. The impossible child, both in the beginning with Yitzchak and the continuation with Moshe, that is a part of the story. The odds of this child not surviving, and then afterwards, just in case somehow a Sarah who can't give birth, just like Moshe's mother can't give birth, can get pregnant and give birth. By the way, now you remember those midrashim that nonetheless Yishmael, the Mitzri, right, the Bat Paro's son, a different path of the same story, is shooting arrows at him, right, puts an apple on his head. Any of you remember this midrash? Or I should have brought it. And are shooting at him, which again, should Yitzchak survive? And of course the answer is no, he shouldn't survive. Why? Because even after the impossible birth, they're trying to kill him. And if Yishmael can't kill him, and Yishmael gets kicked out, so what does God say? Okay, I got to find someone else to try to kill him. So who is still around? Avraham, and that takes you to source number 7, which of course I already alluded to earlier. And the interesting thing about this, and as I told you, at some point this would have been much more part of the story, is that specifically in the Akedah, Yitzchak is described as a Na'ar. Vani v'hanar nilcho adko. So the Nar in both stories also becomes interesting, but that's why earlier I could describe Moshe's Akedah, where he is, if he's already here, now let's make sure that he's not here. And if Yitzchak is already here, let's make sure that he's not here. But the message is the same message. And the message is, of course Yitzchak is going to survive. Why? Because there's a prophecy over here. But it doesn't look like he's going to survive. And I'm going to say it again, just in case you didn't hear me clearly enough. Anybody who's a student of Jewish history has to come to the exact same conclusion. Don't judge the story in the middle of the story. Don't take any one isolated incident and then predict how the story is going to end up. Because I know how the story is going to end up, and I'm going to already tell you now it's going to have a happy ending, because that is God's will. That is what's put into this spiritual DNA of the Jewish people from the very beginning. It's impossibility, compounded by this terrible look of destruction that somehow is able to pick up and survive. And the important thing here, now I said before the access of redemption, the story of Egypt begins, the story of the slavery, the story begins with the birth of Yitzchak. That's when the story begins. Why do I say it begins then? Because God tells Avram, your descendants will eat. So it doesn't tell he has descendants. Of course, for Avram, this is the greatest thing. Your descendants will be slaves. I'll have descendants? They'll be slaves, and then they'll come out. Okay, it's going to be a difficult birth. It'll be a difficult process. That's the whole story. It's a difficult process. But what happens at the end? They're coming back. They're going to come back over here at the end. So in a certain sense, we should have no surprise whatsoever that we've now been able to identify a similarity between the beginning of the story, namely the birth of Yitzchak, the impossibility, this proverbial arrow on his back at every single moment along the way, and then the end of the story. And the end of the story is Moshe taking them out. And Moshe's existence, we see both in the text and midrashically, seem to be absolutely designed to tell you it's the same story. And the only thing which is surprising about what I've said till now is that more likely than not, none of you ever thought about this before I said this today. So that's the only thing. And as I said, once I point it out, you say, like, what are you talking about? Of course, it's staring at you over here because it's the same story. Of course, it's the same story. So I just want to now sharpen everything a little bit to make it a little bit more compelling. But I also told you there's a third act. And we have to get to the third act as well, because we've only so far have managed to get to 2 acts. Rashi in source number 9, which is, of course, on the Brit Bein HaBetarim, it says, Higeria Zaracha, Mishal Nolad Yitzchak. Right? And then it does the counting of the thing. Rashi does all the math. And it goes to Moshe. And Moshe is the end of this arc. Like you start on one, and then you get to, because of course the story is from Yitzchak to Moshe. That's the counting. So again, what I'm saying now is just so obvious. I don't have to prove it. I don't have to bring Rashi for this. But if I could, why not? In source number 10, which is Vayomer Elokim El Avram, Al yirei beinecha al hanar v'amatecha kol asher tomar lecha Sarah shema b'kola ki b'Yitzchak yikrat lecha Zara. So in case we weren't sure about this, Zaracha, who is your Zera? That's Yitzchak. Yitzchak is the chosen one. Yitzchak is the story. Follow Yitzchak. But I said I wanted to sharpen things a little bit, and we already should know by this point, even though that you'll make believe you maybe didn't know or don't know, Yitzchak's story is Pesach. How do I know that? He's born on Pesach. His birth was told and takes place on Pesach. Right? Avram is serving there, ugot, matzot, and so on. Sarah comes back to life, as it were, becomes rejuvenated physically on Pesach. All of this is a Pesach story. And again, this is all a part of the story, which is why source 11 should be of no surprise to us whatsoever, even though it may be a surprise to us. Rabbi Shimon Omer, again, Perik de Belezer, B'shoshen ekad Yitzchak nasat einav lamala v'ra tashchina. Uktiv ki lo yoreni adam v'chai el tachat hamita kahu einav la'ed ziknato. Drawing a direct parallel, and you knew this already, you didn't need me to tell you this part, that Yitzchak's subsequent blindness comes back to the Akedah. And that probably deserves a lot more attention. Shnei Marani quotes the pasuk that Yitzchak now couldn't see. Mikana talomed shasuma chashuv kamet. Higia leil yom haPesach, and Pesach came. Which Pesach is this talking about? The next verse. V'kar Yitzchak la'esav b'no agadav yomalo b'ni zeh halayla kol ha'olam kulo omrim bo halel. So I hope you really like this, because what it just now told us is that Yitzchak, first of all, he celebrates Pesach. Why does he celebrate Pesach? Because that's who Yitzchak is. Yitzchak is Pesach. Yitzchak is born in Pesach. Yitzchak is all about Pesach. It could be we don't understand Pesach well enough yet, but Yitzchak is Pesach. And therefore Yitzchak calls Esav in. Why is he telling him to bring him food today? Because you invite all of your relatives when it comes to Pesach. He's inviting Esav. Come, it's Pesach. But it's really interesting, the particular turn of phrase that he says as an opening, at least according to this midrash, what was it? Everybody, the whole world, says Hallel. By the way, the whole world doesn't say Hallel on Pesach because they don't necessarily identify with a holiday which is all about Jewish redemption. But Yitzchak sees the world, but he can't see. But he sees the world from the perspective on the top of Har HaMoriah with angels, crying in his eyes, and he sees the world from a completely different perspective, which, by the way, colors everything over here. But it's the seeing. It's the seeing. And he says, and the hearing. Yes? It's the seeing and the hearing. And Yitzchak can't see, but he can hear. What does he hear? The whole world is saying Hallel. You realize it's far more likely that he hears the angel saying Hallel than anything else. But he says everybody's saying Hallel. Everyone's saying Hallel. But why are they saying Hallel? Because it's Pesach. V'otzrot tlalim. Now, any of you know what that is? V'otzrot tlalim niftachim b'zeh layla. Now we got someplace now. So you need to know the code. The word tal is connected to something consistently in Chazal. Tal. Hold on to that for one moment. Remember that I have not explained this to you yet. We'll come back to this. Aseli matamim, make for me food. Ad sheni bodi avarecha, v'ruach kodesh mishiva v'omeret al tucham et lechem ra'inayin. I'm skipping. I'm Rivka Yaakov b'ni alayla zeh otzrot talim niftachim bo. By the way, the same thing. This is about the talim, but you don't know what that is. Okay? Ha'elyonim shira. What does Rivka know? Who's saying shira? It's the angels who are saying shira tonight. But Yitzchak, again, his whole birth was predicted by the angels. The angels come and talk about it, and it's Pesach, and the angels are all saying shira. Halayla zeh atidim banech lilgael miyad sheibud. Your descendants. Yaakov is the one who he has purchased the birthright. Yaakov is the one whose children are going to be enslaved. Yaakov is the one whose children go out, which means Yaakov bought in to the Yitzchak story. And Yitzchak is the Zerah who identifies with the Avraham story. Yaakov's children, and Yaakov himself is the one who's going to go down to Egypt, and his children are the ones who go, but his children are also going to come back. By the way, Yaakov has to come back because that again is this microcosm of the larger story. They're going to come back. Halayla hazet yidim lo mashira, and it goes back again to the point about the shira. Notice how it just now shifted from Hallel to shira. Of course, what is Hallel? Hallel is shira. So part of the Pesach experience is that you have to say Hallel. You have to sing. You have to break off into song. Aseh matamim lavicha. And he says, you're the one who will do the cooking for Pesach. Right? You're the one who needs to bring the korban Pesach. You're the one who now needs to take care of all of this, and then you'll get the brachot. And afterwards it says, even, does Yitzchak need to eat two animals? He brought him two. It says, ela echad keneged ha-pesach, ve'echad la'asot lo ma'atamim le'echol. The Taninan, because we learned in the Mishnah, ha-pesach enu ba ela ala sova. That Pesach is eating, it is food of liberation, and you don't eat too much of it. You already eat it on a full stomach. You eat the korban shlamim, which is the first korban, and then you eat the last kazayit you eat of the korban Pesach. So it's not something that you're starving. We're all starving on Pesach. By the time you get to that point of the Seder, it's like you end up eating like lots of cucumbers beforehand. According to the Gemara, you should eat a kazayis of the karpas. Sometimes I don't know. People have a choice; they have to eat by that point, and it's saying that Pesach is this experience of freedom, and the way that we experience freedom is eating as a free person as well. But all of this, the Pirkei Lezer, that's what's important. It just now took the famous scene of Yaakov going into Yitzchak, and it's reading it as the Pesach Seder, and it focused on a couple of things. Yeah, the Korban Pesach was brought in over here along the way, but it focused on the Hallel, it focused on the song, it focused on the Shira, and it focused on the future. So I'll say it again, and this is interesting. I also think by the time you get to the end of this source, and it speaks about the Kol Yaakov, I have to kind of wonder, what was it when he says, oh, this is the Kol Yaakov? Is it the Kol in terms of a singing voice? Does he hear that Yaakov knows how to sing? That Yaakov is saying Hallel in a certain sense? Is it just the voice of Yaakov, or is there something a little bit deeper over here, especially now when you understand this midrashic background, where the whole thing is based on Yitzchak hearing everybody is singing. So does Esav walk in, give me, here's the food, Dad, and Yaakov walks in, singing, as it were, and saying Hallel, talking about God, praising God. Yaakov walks in praising God when he goes in to see his father. So therefore, is Yaakov really saying Hallel over here? And again, I know I went a little bit further, but that becomes a lot more interesting. Of course, when we get to source 13, we leave Egypt. We're free, except for one problem. What's that? The Egyptians start to chase us down. So again, the odds of survival just now fell impossibly. The most sophisticated army, technologically, with all of their tanks and all of their weapons and all of their trained soldiers, or chasing after these people who are more primitive, these slaves who, again, we have our chamushim, right? We have our sticks and stones and our primitive weapons to fight against this great big army force. And what is our response? Vayomer Moshe Amabli in Kvarim b'Mitzrayim lakachtanu lamut b'midbar. Are there no graves there that we're going to die? Death is on their minds because survival seems impossible. By the way, it's the same story again, but now you realize that Moshe's impossible birth and then death, that is part of the Pesach story. So where does the Pesach story continue to? It continues to the seventh day. And what happens on the seventh day? It's impossible. The water is right there. By the way, go back to the Moshe story, right on the banks of the water, and it's impossible. And there are these things which are threatening him. And again, you've never thought about that either, that Moshe himself thrown to the banks of the river with the water on one side and Paro's soldiers, as it were, hunting for Jewish kids on the other side, and now being found by Bat Paro. Again, the chances of survival are minimal. So over here, the only difference is that it's all the people, they're able to speak, they can talk about their fear, they can talk about the impossibility of their situation. And essentially, what's Moshe's answer? Well, not yet. Hashem elech, Hashem halach, Hashem yimlok l'olam va'ed. That's really the response over here. And Vayomer Moshe Lam, al tirau. That's great, don't be afraid. You only tell people not to be afraid when they're afraid, right? I don't know how often that works. As often as calm down works, right?
Don't worry.
Or don't worry. Hityatzvu. Come together, u're'u Yeshuat Hashem, and you're going to see God's salvation. Asher yaseh lechem hayom. You're going to see it. Ki asher ra'item. Again, you're going to see. And Mitzrayim hayom, you're not going to see it again. And we know what follows afterwards. What follows afterwards is they go through and they say Shira, which means the Shira on the seventh day, the Az Yashir, is a Shira of all the people feeling that they just now went from death to life. They should have died. They realize this. It's a near-death experience. That is what the seventh day is. The Gemara in source 14 says, Gemara in Sanhedrin, Tanya, Rav Meir, minayin l'tchiyat hametim min haTorah. Where do we see the concept of tchiyat hametim? Shenemar az yashir Moshe v'nei Israel. It's really interesting, is that, and there's many ways to understand this. I'm just reading the words in the simplest way. The Shira, az yashir, the point of the Gemara is that it's future oriented, az yashir, but it's interesting that it's connecting, az yashir is about tchiyat hametim. But it's not just because of the future, it's also what they're experiencing at this point. It's also interesting in source 15 that Miriam, of all people, has a very specific role in terms of the Shira as well. So I still owe you a couple things. Let's see how far we can get. One is source 16. Source 16 is going to tell us that there's a drought, and Yitzchak does what his father did, and what's that? What his parents did, and he starts heading towards Egypt. Vayarei love Hashem vayomer al tered Mitzrayma shechon ba'aretz asher omer lecha gur ba'aretz hazot. You're going to stay here. V'herbeiti et zaracha, and again the same message comes across, and you're going to become so numerous. Yitzchak himself, by the way, doesn't come numerous. His children do. His descendants do. On the other hand, and you'll see in a second why I'm saying the other hand, Moshe, I said he's the other end of this, if you want, the spiritual architecture. It starts with Yitzchak, but Yitzchak is interesting because he is not part of the slavery. He is not part of the servitude. He never leaves Israel. And it's more complex than that. Because you're going to be strangers in a land which isn't yours. He's a stranger in his own land, but not the servitude. Moshe, on the other hand, who, by the way, also personally avoids servitude. That's interesting. But Moshe is somebody who never fulfills the very end of the prophecy because he never makes the land of Israel. So Yitzchak never leaves Israel, Moshe never enters Israel, and now you realize that this really interesting relationship between the two of them are two sides of the same coin, and you also now realize that to continue the story, we need to find someone else. I do want to point out something else that also we tend to kind of gets eclipsed within the larger story, and that is that Moshe is a Levi. And if Moshe is a Levi, one of the jobs or roles of a Levi is to sing. which means that maybe the most organically, spiritually natural expression of Moshe's inner spiritual identity is the Shira. Az Yashir Moshe v'nei Yisrael. And I think we tend to, again, if you have somebody who was there by Har Sinai, and gets the Torah down from heaven, it's a little hard to focus. Yeah, but he can sing also. It's like, what are you talking about? He's the Gadol Hadar. By the way, Rav Yoshev had a great voice. Okay, you never knew that. You never cared about that. It didn't like to make it. It happened to be that he had a great voice and he loved music and he loved singing and so on and so forth. Actually, in his biography, he talks about, I think it was Yossele Rosenblatt may have come to Israel once, and he very much wanted to go and to hear him, but he thought it was Bittul Torah. So therefore, he fought against his Yetzer Hara to go to a concert and hear him sing or hear him daven or wherever it was, and he stayed with his Gemara open and learned. I believe that I saw that in Rav Yashiv's biography, and he loved music, so great. But again, isn't that like a little like footnote and so unimportant in terms of all the Torah that he taught? So I can look at Moshe and say, what are you talking about? No, but Moshe is a Levi, and that's something which is spiritual, and that's something which we realize now is an important part of the story because it's part of the redemption. Because after all, what is singing? Singing is an ability of an emotion which is inside to be expressed through the words because either it brings joy or is an expression of joy. The person who can then sing words of praise, that is an expression of belief, that is an expression of emunah. So therefore, the Jews are able to do that, right? You remember the Prince of Egypt? They got it wrong. They're already singing as they leave Egypt, but they don't sing until they actually see the Egyptians are dead, and it's the wicked witch is dead, and now everything's over, and now they can believe, which means the expression of the belief. But Moshe had said it beforehand. Watch. Keep your eye on. See what's going on over here. But it's then the music comes out. But Yitzchak over there, according to Pirkei Eliezer, he says, don't you hear the singing all over the place? Don't you hear that there's this great expression? And Rivka says to Yaakov, no, it's Hallel. It's Hallel. It's going on in heaven, which means there's this understanding of what's taking place. But again, I'm going to say this again. This is all a part of the story. So if we've made it this far, then I told you there's the prequel, and then there's a story, and then there's perhaps the sequel, if you will, but it's the continuation. And we get a hint of it in Rashi in source number 18. It says, it goes back to the pasuk we had in the very beginning, and it was talking about these women who were keeping the kids alive, and it says, one of the things that it says there is, Vayitav Elokim lemiladot, and it says, what did they do? And it says, Vayaslo batim. And it says that Miriam received Malchut. Hid'ita Mesechet Sota. Mesechet Sota, if you look it up, it says, Batei Malchut, David Nami mi Miriam Kati. That Miriam was an ancestor of David HaMelech. So David HaMelech is the continuation of the story. Because we're going to talk about singing in Judaism, we're going to talk about Hallel. I don't know how you talk about Hallel, you talk about singing, if you don't get to Tehillim. I mean, that's precisely where this leads you to. So let me note something which maybe you know, maybe you didn't know. There is this really interesting turn of phrase which is found in the Gemara in Sanhedrin in source 20, Daf Tzadi Vav. It talks about Mashiach bar Nafli Karatle Amar Le'in Dichtiv Vayomahu Makid et Sukat David Hanofelet. A Nefel is a stillborn. And it could be you never heard this. It's a Beferish Zohar in source number 21, but it's really what the Gemara meant over here. It said, Zes Sefer Toldot Adam. Reb Yitzchak, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Adam Dumiot Shokol Otem Darot, that he showed him all the generations, Shevo La'olam, Kochach Me'Yisrael, Malchei Olam, Shetidun La'amod Olam. Higil David Melech Yisrael, Shnolad Umet. That Adam sees that he sees his soul, he sees the neshama, and he sees he dies in childbirth. He's never alive. Amar lo me'ashanim shali alvelo shivim shana. Let me lend him 70 years. V'garu me'adam shivim shana ve'elo otam HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'David. So first of all, understand what's pretty about this. There's something pretty here. God said to Adam, the day that you eat from the tree, you're going to die. Adam lives 930 years. A day for God is 1,000 years. So therefore, when God says he's going to die today, it's from God's perspective, he should have lived for 1,000. But he lives from 1,000 minus 70. David lived for 70 years. What the Zohar is saying is the 70 years of David was given by Adam, and that is why he lives for the 70 years. But it's more than that. It's that Adam caused exile, and David brings about redemption, future redemption. So therefore, it calls the future Messiah, the Ben David, Ben Naphtali, the child of the stillborn, as it were, which goes back to the same point I've been saying from the beginning, the impossibility of salvation ever possibly taking place. And now think about David's life. Think about again. Do you want to now compare the Jewish people taking on the whole Egyptian army and David taking on Goliath? And Goliath with all of his weapons and so on, and David with primitive, with a slingshot. Because do you realize yet it's the same story? When you think about David and all the people who want to kill him at every single turn in his life, he's threatened. And again, what are the chances of David's survival? It seems to be something which shouldn't possibly happen, but nonetheless, David is able to constantly to sing. And to say songs, Lo emut ki achiev asaper maaseh ka, right? I'm not going to die. How can you have that kind of optimism? No, I'm not going to die. I'm going to live. We're going to do that. Hodul Hashem ki tov, and so on. And that's the Hallel that we end up saying, which means when you understand all this, again, I think things are a little bit deeper. There's this other point, and now hopefully we'll understand as much of this as we can quickly in the last couple of minutes. In source 27, Moshe is at the sneh, and God tells him something which is remarkable. By the way, somebody looking for really short Dvar Torah, you could take the next 3 minutes, not the next 5 minutes, the next 3 minutes. It says, "V'natati et chen ha'am hazeh be'inei Mitzrayim." I am going to make the Egyptians find favor within the Jews. By the way, that's the same way that we imagine all of the plagues as God's manipulation of nature. Here already you have a manipulation of human nature. As much as people are always troubled by, he hardened Paro's heart, this is the same phenomena, but just taking place in a slightly different fashion. I love the way the Targum Yonatan expresses this. The Egyptians are suddenly going to feel love towards you. Now that is something which is strange. It's functional. You want to borrow things from them. If they suddenly love you, they're going to want to give you things. But realize there is a manipulation that takes place. Now that is part of the redemption story, but it's also part of a future story, and that's what I still need to explain. If you actually read these verses a little bit more, when right afterwards, when Moshe then questions, will the people really believe in me? Well, he just now told you I'm going to manipulate the Egyptians. Why can't the Jews now believe in you? Which means that if God is micromanaging already, so once you're micromanaging, so of course. And by the way, what's really interesting, when God says right afterwards to him, and isn't Aaron, right? Halevi on the way. A Levi is somebody who sings. It's also interesting, and that's the place that Aaron is called a Levi. If he's a Levi, means he's optimistic. And what does he say? With love in his heart. Because a Levi sings, he's optimistic, and there's love in his heart. So, by the way, it's the same point again. There's love in his heart. There is love in the hearts of the Egyptians, and all of this should be interesting, and we don't know what to do with it yet. The impossibility of David's birth and life and so on. He is the one who's going to start playing music ready for Shaul. That's one of the earliest scenes. Don't you have any other kids? Right? Oh no, there's this the youngest one, like the scrawny, one. But David is still, despite all the odds, he's David. When you get to source 33, which by the way is again about a nar, which is now again telling you why the nar was once a more important point of all this, when it talks about the Messianic age, v'yatsa choter migezer Yishai, v'netzem misharashav Yifra, v'nachalav ruach Hashem, ruach chachma v'ina, ruach etzah gvura, ruach dat v'yirat Hashem. So what's then going to happen? It's that we're going to get to this Messianic time where v'garzev im keves v'nermeim gedi. Now how does that happen? So the Rambam says that nations of the world are all going to suddenly be able to live together. By the way, that means it's the same process. Rav Kook actually said this in a more interesting way. He said that it's a phenomena of of evolution. It's a spiritual evolution where people identify with the innermost good within them, and then it comes out, and then love comes all over the world, and then we live in world's peace. And that's the messianic vision that takes place. And we understand that when we left Egypt, there was one moment of that, and that's when they lent us things, but that's why that's an important part of the story. There was this possibility. We realized that Aaron is ready, he's feeling brotherly love so much different than all of Bereshit, but that's a part of the story. If in that third act, when we get to David, who's full of song and full of optimism, that there's going to be people who can identify with that inner song. And that's what David's able to do. But there's one more level to all of this that I want to note, and that's the thing I left over, that I hope that you're upset with me that I didn't tell you what it meant yet, and that was the, what? What was it? The tal. The tal. I don't know if I included it here. There's Yerushalmi. I thought I included it, maybe not. There's a teaching. It's in a bunch of different sources. That Tal, source number 12. Kach amar lo Kadosh Baruch Hu leEliyahu, after you bring someone back to life. Tal she'eina meitim chayim ela b'tlalim. Tal is a symbol of Tchiyat HaMeitim. Springtime is when Pesach takes place. In the springtime, we, in Israel at least, all say or read Hatal. The springtime is a time the Jewish people who look like they're dead, there's no chance of survival, we're deep in a place of death. That's also an important part of the story. Egypt is a place of death. Egypt is a place which celebrates death. They worship death. I don't know how many slaves they actually put in the pyramids when they built them, but it's a place which is built on death, celebrates death, is all about death. When Chazal tell us in the Zohar that they went to the 49th level of Tumah, it's Tumah's mate compounded in the worst possible way. Leaving Egypt is Tchiat HaMeitim. Leaving Egypt is coming back to life. And that's why that was all over that Pirkei Eliezer, that this is a night of coming back to life, which means Sarah comes back to life, as it were, to have a child like this. Yitzchak has to have the Akedah, where his life is threatened and a sword is on his head, so that he can come back to life and be part of the Pesach story. Should I say that again? Because you never saw the Akedah like that. That's the reason of the Akedah. Because Yitzchak is Pesach. And Pesach, people come back to life. We need a symbol of somebody who comes back to life. And I know Judaism doesn't talk that much. I already talked about Isaiah 50, doesn't talk that much about resurrection. But Yitzchak comes back to life, because that's the story. Moshe comes back to life. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't have been born. He shouldn't have survived. He shouldn't be alive. And all of those elements are here in order to express the exact same idea. The impossibility of the Jewish people surviving, but it's only impossible when you look at those little snapshots along the way and you're stuck in it. And how do we get out of it? So we have to sing. You have to, just like Rivka said, yeah, you have to say the Hallel now. You have to say the Hallel, because when you have that optimism, and who writes those songs? The ones who writes the songs is David. And David lives the same type of a life of this impossibility of survival, because for us, the very birth of the Jewish people is against nature, is impossible. The very survival of the Jewish people is against all odds, is insurmountably impossible. And therefore it has to take place in the spring, after a long winter. Everything looks like it's dead, and then things start to grow again. He goes, why is this happening? No, this is our story. Because Sarah comes back to life. Yocheved comes back to life. Yitzchak comes back to life. Moshe comes back to life. David comes back to life. Because that's who we are. That's where we started. That's how we got out of Egypt. And that's the eventual messianic story. The only difference going to be along the way is that the song gets louder and louder. And the ability to sing gets more profound. And you get to the point that everybody can sing, that it even has a spillover effect on all the animals, and suddenly they're able to live together also in peace and harmony. But all of that, it's right there in the story itself, because coming back to life includes that element of suddenly feeling that brotherhood, or feeling that love, or feeling that identity. And maybe it happened at that moment with Bat Paro as well. She feels this, she sees this. I want to be a part of this story. The story that I'm in is a story of death. Again, it's the killing field, it's horrific. I don't want to be a part of this story. I want to be a part of life. And by Matan Torah as well, we're told that they all died and he sprinkles tal on all of them. They all come back to life. And Judaism is an existence of believing in the impossible, because for us, the impossible is not just probable. The impossible is the divine wish, and the divine wish is one which we understand, and we're able to understand this. Then we also could be like OUisrael, who are able to say Shira. And the question is, at which point do we sing? At which point do we celebrate? And we know that our existence over here today, unfortunately, is always one. And I don't care if you can identify with the dry bones that come back to life, or you're going to think about a Holocaust and how we somehow can walk out of Auschwitz and enter into the land of Israel, or somehow it could be by the Nova. It could be, but they walk out and they sing. We walk out and we sing because we understand a trust and a faith and a belief that that future is one which is part of God's will. And if it's part of the story that God wrote, now you understand that the fingerprints are here at every single step along the way. It's part of this impossibility. But that impossibility is this idea. It's Yitzchak, it's Moshe, it's David, and it's really what OUisrael is.